for that discussion. All right. And we're back with another Pickled Dragon Unscripted, but this time we're going to have our second game master or dungeon master, I think, in this case, based on the questions that have been posed to us, Roundtable. So we've got with us Dan, who's also known as the Inked Mage on Instagram. And with us again, our good friends Nasser, Ham, and the gentleman GM himself, Malcolm. So we've got people from literally all over the world, all over the United States. And we're very pleased to have them with us again. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in because I know Dan is the only person who's ever really introduced himself on the show. So I was going to give you a chance to do that. But the other folks with us have been on before. And I think we'll just jump into the questions then. Dan, why don't you take it away for a minute?
All right. Hi. Thanks so much for having me. This is, I could talk endlessly, about D&D. Just ask my wife. And, the questions that you've posed and just in general, are things that I think about and talk about. So I'm happy to dive in with the discussion. So if you want to start off with a certain question, I haven't taken part in your roundtables before, so
yeah. And I get, like I've said to people all the time, prior to having guests on the Pickled Dragon, I would just kind of take the questions I was posed and read them off and give my thoughts to it. I never enjoyed doing this alone, so I brought in the best and brightest, as they say, to help me out with some of these, because different perspectives are extremely valuable. So the first question, and actually this question was asked many times, and I just learned that it's been asked many times because it's kind of a hot button topic, maybe. And should racial bonuses be eliminated from Dungeons and Dragons? And I guess the issue revolving around it is the penalty to intelligence that orcs get. I have an opinion on this, but the idea being you're creating a race of creatures, of humanoids, monstrous humanoids, whatever you want to call them, but humanoids that are less intelligent than other races. So Nasser, I was going to give you a chance to run with that first, because I guess that there's a lot of people saying, no, we don't want to make changes to this system. I think it's very apt to the way it's built. And then there are folks who are saying that, we need to move on from that and get away from the idea that there are creatures that are lesser in some way and creatures that are, elevated in some way. So
I think if you remember in our last conversation, you guys were talking about that you guys saw orcs when they first were introduced in D&D were these pure killing machines, if you guys remember that conversation, right? So when they first introduced them, that's what they were. They were pure killing machines and you couldn't play them, right? So as D&D began to evolve, you started to play. People started wanting to play them. So they started introducing the differences between, from a mechanical point of view, you want to make you can't have all the races the same, or the species, if you want to call them, the same. So there has to be a mechanical difference between them. Otherwise, you're not adding something to the game. So I think that point is from a mechanical point of view to differentiate between what you're playing. So people want variety in gaming. And that's what they wanted, I think, when they first started. From my point of view is I can understand why sometimes people may get offended by it, but I don't think people should look at it as a bad thing. It's by the end of the day, you're playing an imaginary creature. And if let's take, for example, the Forgotten Realms, right? If we look at who created the species or the races in the Forgotten Realms, right? you'll notice that there's a lot of different gods have created them. So therefore, like if we're debating it logically, right? Therefore, I don't think they're going to be the same, because each god has his, like the way he creates their creatures or the races, they're going to be different than each other. So I think in that point, that like the argument is, just take a look at the source, the original material, right, about that world. To me, I don't think it makes a difference. I think it adds a variety to the game. And I don't think, like, from my point, this is just a personal point of view, I don't think we should look at it in a negative view. Because if we were to say, oh, this is similar to real world, look, Forgotten Realms already has its own cultures. It talks and it represents a lot of other cultures in it, like real world cultures, and they're working towards making it more inclusive, art-wise and everything. So I don't think when we look at the other races, we should look at them as real world people. Just a personal point of view from my point. I think that's how I see it, at least.
So I want to throw, because I don't think this has been thought of, at least no one, I haven't seen. When I talked to some folks, I think I mentioned before we started filming that I don't really keep up with this stuff very well. Maybe I should, because it gives interesting talking points, right? But I wanted to throw this out, and maybe there's you could compare and contrast the idea, because nobody seems to have a problem with the idea of the high elves having a +1 to intelligence. Mm-hmm. You know, so that suddenly elevates them all above the people that don't have penalties to intelligence. So is that the same thing? And does the intelligence stat to you in D&D really equate to true intelligence? Because I've always thought of intelligence as your book learning, like how you've been educated, and wisdom as your ability to actually problem solve. And I don't know of any races that have a penalty to wisdom. I could be wrong, but you know, what do you think, Malcolm?
This is a man. This one is, there's so many ways to address this one particular issue. First off, I think, just sharing my opinion on it, I will say, I don't think kobolds are marginalized people. I don't think orcs are black people, right? Like, that's not something I inherently believe. I do agree with some of the criticism that, like, Wizards of around, like, maybe why Wizards of the Coast has done some of the stuff, and it comes off as a bit pandering a lot of times and things like that, or trying to kind of be a part of, like, the right kind of way, because people are complaining about it maybe on these Reddit posts and things like that. They're trying to address these things they see as quote unquote issues. I think as a gamer who's been playing this game all my life, there are inherent things that I see in most fantasy worlds that, let's say Tolkien's the godfather of this, that were created by, that, let's face it, that are originated from the Western European society, right? And like Dan said, everyone loves Tolkien, but at the same time, when you look at the world, we love Tolkien because you have to understand that most of the fantasy we enjoy across the world is heavily based in Western European society's focus. That's why we have to add inclusion to it, because Tolkien sees all of the free men in his world as white. It's the way they're described in the story. When you start to look at Sauron's men coming over, the way anybody else is described, they are kind of described as the others, the other nations, those that doesn't make them bad. It doesn't make them good, but they're not the same as the free men, right? Like there are these very apparent differences. And when you're reading that as someone like me, who's a black kid, you start to see more similarities between the monsters sometimes than you do. You're like, wow, oh, these people are like, if I was a half orc, like when the first time I started playing D, I always played half or orcs or half orcs because I knew what it felt like to walk in a tavern and the record scratches, right? Like someone turns and looks. And I do understand, I don't agree with every like act of inclusion I see in entertainment. It can get really exhausting, right? Like, but you have these silly arguments. I feel like we get into these places where we go, I hear Dungeon Masters say, we talk about to exhaustion about world building and how important it is and how to make it grounded and feel real. And then whenever anything is about changing any of that to make it feel more real, we're like, but just remember, it's just a fantasy game, right? And it's like, well, I think that this way of thinking about races is kind of archaic because our D&D players are not playing one of generic people from their race. They're paying somebody, an individual that has usually left that race to go off to accomplish new goals in the world. So I actually disagree. While I'm starting to disagree with the negative pluses, I'm also starting to see no use for a high elf to have +2 intelligence just because whoever, and let's face it, I like what Nazar said, the gods created these people, but at the same time, we're basing most of this off of our classic authors. And it's not about racism necessarily, but it's about the way they saw the world and they saw the structures of the world, and politics and racism play into that. For example, I've heard a lot of, and I'm going to end here because I know I'm going on, but I hear a lot of like people arguing about this new Lord of the Rings and why they're black dwarves, right? And I could see that argument. I'm not necessarily against it. Oh yeah, because when you make the argument that dwarves live in caves and therefore they would be paler and they wouldn't be dark, I'm like, okay, I'll give you a point there. But then why in Forgotten Realms do we have two races, the Dagar and the Drow, who live deep in the underground and they are black as night? Because you have, for years, anybody who's not white has subscribed the idea of a shade of your skin being a shade too dark. You suddenly become one of the monster races. I have a list of all my paints. When I paint my miniatures, when I got every D&D set comes with like a couple of different colors that signify skin tones. And then anything darker than a shade of tan suddenly becomes Minotaur brown, Bugbear brown, Owlbear brown. So think about what you have to understand. It's very hard to see the world when you're the majority. You just see it like, what are we talking about here? Right. But when you get into the nitty gritty, when you're playing at the table, you're like, why is it that all the bad races are so dark? That's it's like, why is it? And I don't want to change it. I don't want to change it you could, but I think in my world, the Drow would look more like vampires, right? Because that makes more sense to me, right? So if they change that canon, a lot of people would probably kind of bitch and moan about it. But like, I could see the argument, right? So I'm starting to say is if I can see the argument, I can start to change. I think people should start to be able to see why some of these changes are being done, because maybe they lead to more making individual characters and not like stereotypical clones of all these different races. Just my
I've seen, now the only arguments I've seen about the dwarf in the Amazon series is that she didn't have a beard.
Yeah, I've heard that one too.
But I think you're right there. I think
I agree.
Before I know someone's probably going to comment that dark elves come from Norse mythology. But I don't know that Norse mythology that they were actually dark skinned. I don't know. I don't know enough about
I don't know
mythology,
either.
or if the word dark more meant like evil or
Well, you got to know there are more dark connotations in the human. When everything is dark is a negative connotation in the English language, right? So black is going to have more negative connotations than it has positive connotations, and that's something that you kind of deal with every day, and we won't talk about that, but that bleeds into fantasy, right? So it makes sense why these races, if you want to easily signify someone being evil, it makes sense with the language to signify them as darker, right?
Yeah, and I think that was.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I think that was like a big miss with like I was just mentioning earlier. I'm reading The Wheel of Time right now. And The Wheel of Time, 14 books that span all these countries and all these different people. The Saldaeans definitely have some sort of Middle Eastern tint to them, and the Empress of the Shan is a black woman. So there are definitely races, and they're not necessarily, they have different cultures, but none of them are inherently evil. And I think that they missed a big opportunity with the Hulu. I think it's on Hulu with that show. Because I think they felt like, okay, we need the inclusion, so they made every village a myriad of different races, rather than taking the opportunity and saying these people are from Saldea, and these people are from the Blight, and these people, are Outlanders. But in any case, I'm rambling now, and I'm thinking that's unfair. I tried to stop myself, but I have a hard time. What do you think, Ham?
My simple answer to, should we remove like stat modifiers, be it intelligence or otherwise, from the races, I'd lean towards no. And the simple reason for that is that, okay, let me backtrack. I say this with the acknowledgement that the original literature from which these species or races were kind of inspired from, they were a product of their time. And the D&D game today, 5th edition, is also a product of its time. And I think that there's a young adult and adult generation today where, to what we were saying just before we went live, Matt brought up this point where it's kind of like, depending on what area you grew up from, you establish a certain worldview as to how to look at things. And I think that it is an inescapable, unavoidable sort of phenomena, if you will, or phenomenon that people will incorporate their worldviews into the games and into the interpretation of the games that they play. So with that acknowledgement, I respect it. I have to say, honestly, I respect that point of view, right? If social justice issues are the topic of the era that we live in, it comes as no surprise that they will reflect in how people measure and assess these games that they play, and then go even deeper in terms of how these games are actually structured and written by the designers and who they cater to, et cetera, and so forth. But with that acknowledgement, I've DM'd like about 3 going on 4 generations of players now. And I've kind of seen a very broad spectrum of change, both societally, both whatever. And I'll be the first to put my hand up and say, I was an active resistor to change. Like, it was very hard for me to embrace a lot of ideas, or not even embrace, just to absorb, understand some of these topics that we were talking about, that have come up through the ages. And my own transformative sort of intellectual journey was a gradual thing. It happened from opening up and listening and learning and reflecting and making up my own mind. Now, the thing is, when it comes to why stats probably shouldn't be eliminated, is I think one of the fatal flaws of, as Malcolm rightfully said, that end up defining these kinds of arguments is a bit silly, is that there's too much attention to nuance and not enough attention to the core substance. Games are supposed to be a unifying factor between people. It's supposed to be about fun at the table. It's supposed to be about telling wonderful stories together and creating believable characters together. And characters and stories need antagonists. They need like antagonizing forces, I should say. So to me, it makes sense just on that logic to have variance and diversity. I think a homogenized set of species that are all the same is just too human. That, if you will, it's too much humanization of the species and not enough diversity. Like when you play a human, you can play, and again, addressing Malcolm's point, you can play a human of any skin tone, any culture influence in the background. Doesn't have to be a specific culture, but something influenced or derived from a real world culture. And, that's because you're playing human. And, at the table, that's, I'd say, very inclusive. But when you play a dwarf, are you really playing a human? What does a dwarf teenager look like if, they're 30 something, saying when they hit their teenage years, and, and elves live for thousands of years, how do you humanize that? You see what I'm saying? It's just by default, it's built into the very construct that these are different species to humans. So why are we projecting human onto them? And why are we projecting human issues onto them? And why not distinctly create that variance through the mechanics in the game, like the stats? Do you see what I mean? And then that's kind of the perspective that I come from. It literally, to my mind, whenever this discussion comes up, it really begs the question, is this a moot point? Is this really a relevant topic? And I'm not going to be like flippant and just dismiss it and sort of foo-foo it away. It's obviously a relevant topic because it's on the mouths and minds of so many people. But does it merit the heated debate about it? I would argue probably not, simply because, you know, your table, your rules, it's what your players want. It's what they want to play. Be courteous, be kind, be inclusive, be welcoming, host your players, you know? And we talked about this in the last time we were on the Pickled Dragons channel, right? You know, like I was very verbose with my point, with this very point back then. And I, mind you, I'm still verbose. I'm very, very sorry. I'm eating up like time. But to conclude the point, no, I don't think we should remove them. I think that I think they don't make or break the game. I think what really breaks the game is like an overemphasis on basically homogenizing everything and killing variance. And yet, I say that again with respect and acknowledgement to the fact that if you want homogenized races or species in your game, have at it, man. It's your game. Do your thing, work your magic, and have fun. You know, that's really what it comes down to my mind, anyway.
I think everyone's making some excellent points, and I'll give everyone a chance to kind of like, after they've heard everyone out, you know, to throw in anything else they want to say. But Dan,
yeah, so
you're ready.
So this, thank you. Yeah, so this is cool, right? So man, you guys have given me so much to work off of. Let me just say, first off, D&D, what did they do even pretty early on into the years was, you know, the idea that like typical fantasy originated in kind of like a medieval Europe, medieval England. That's just kind of the setting that we you know, some people love. But they also went on to create Karatur, and Oriental Adventures, if you wanted an Asian theme campaign, and Al-Qadim, if you wanted a Middle Eastern one, and they had areas for Norse, and they had stuff for like South America even. They did this to provide these areas. I mean, to do something different and provide experiences for people. You know, maybe some people would identify and want to play in those realms because they identified with those regions, and it gave opportunities for people who had no experience in that but an interest in that to go and role play in that. The thing that everybody has to remember is, first off, and this has been the dirty secret of every DM for as long as I've known, you make the rules at your table, and so if you wanted somebody to play a goblin early on at your table, you played a goblin, and everybody's homebrew game was the same. I really agree with the point of by taking away all the bonuses or reductions in stats. Well, then that does kind of homogenize it, right? It makes everybody the same, and it's like, oh, if everybody's the same, it's like, it's the same thing as saying like, when everybody's special, nobody's special. I mean, and let's look at it. You want to talk about some marginalized people? I mean, in that case, well, what about the villagers? It's always the heroes. They're the heroes are like the great ones. Well, why shouldn't we then look at like, you know, the villagers and start making them more heroic? The point is, everybody should do what they want and what is comfortable, you know, and really get to know your players at the table, right? And I just think that ultimately it's got to be everybody's decision. But to me, a dwarf getting -1 to his charisma, you know, in first edition, you know, except for, you know, regards to other dwarves, but he had a bonus to, you know, his constitution, or an elf had a minus to his constitution, but a bonus to dexterity or intelligence. These differences added to their strength, right? And I mean, everybody's different. We all bring something different to the table, and it should be the same way in the game. I think they add to the role-playing factor. And I think, like, you know, for example, like 5e, not just like the racial bonuses or limitations or variances, but I mean, it's just a very pro player friendly, like the characters like are pretty much unstoppable. And I think this sort of thing, in my opinion, would further the idea that people are relying on mechanics and stats rather than, you know, playing outside of the character sheet, you know, diving into the role-playing aspect. So Ham had that great point. And I mean, like, when I play a dwarf or like an Eladrin or something, I'm not just looking at it like, oh, if I play this particular race, how can I min-max and benefit? I want to dive into that role-playing. You know, I played an Eladrin in my game, and he was, you know, aloof. He loved his companion friends, but he really didn't see any great benefit of being a member of another race. He was very aloof and not always nice. I mean, he came across abrasive, but he didn't mean it. And so whatever race I play, whatever class I play, I want to dive into the role playing. And when I'm a DM, I encourage that in my players. I want them to dive in and experience something that's different and be believable and authentic, because ultimately it comes down to the storytelling, the shared storytelling, and that's the most important thing. So if you don't want to have stat increases or reductions, don't have it. If you want it, go for it. Do whatever makes sense for you. Read the room that you're in. Chances are your players and you know what works for them. I see all the arguments as reductive anyway, because it's just like people are always looking for something to just. It's like you find something we all love, and then everybody's just like, oh, well, what can we do? I mean, like if you want to play, a character in a wheelchair, okay. I mean, it doesn't. You got to hope that there's some underground liches that are inclusive enough to include some wheelchair accessible dungeons and stuff. And I mean, but again, it's whatever you want to feel comfortable with. I mean, I think as long as we come together and we acknowledge that, hey, we love the game, we love gaming, and you want to know, we're not gonna like it's a difference in, what, I like spicy food, somebody else doesn't like spicy food. I'm not going to argue about it. I'm going to make food if you come over my house, and I'm going to maybe I'll make spicy for me and not spicy for you. I mean, I think the focus should be on what we love, and I think that's the most important thing. But again, I agree with Ham, especially. I think it homogenized them, and I think the focus should always be about getting back to the story and getting off that character sheet, getting off of, well, my proficiency bonus, and if I cast this spell in combination with this. No, I get to the heart of it. Play. If you're playing a halfling, be a halfling, embrace it as much as you can. And if you want to have a so I was playing, I had one character who was playing, a black character, and in my world. So I was like, oh, okay, here you came from this portion of the world that was down here, and ultimately the characters visited there. For me, I like to have things kind of make sense, and I don't mind having people come in from all over. I mean, I played a samurai in first edition, in the midst of a fantasy campaign. He got transported there magically. The DM, kind of hand waved that, and that was cool. It was cool to play something else. But again, it's. I hope it should never be a point that everybody argues about. Instead, it should be like we love this and share it.
Do you think and this is for anybody, do you think, because I think everybody here has been playing for a really long time, and
yes.
I think that Malcolm and Ham make a very good point about the games being a product of their times. But I can remember myself being a young guy and being like, I really want that 18100 strength, being first edition. I want that 18100 strength. Never got one, but do you think that
Matt be ambidextrous because of drow? I mean, first edition, you couldn't play a drow right away, and I didn't look at a drow and think, oh, he's a bad guy because he's got black skin. I thought, man, I remember the picture in the Fiend Folio of the drow, right? And he's there with a crossbow, and I thought, that is a badass looking elf, and I wanted to play one because I also wanted to be ambidextrous, and the drow were ambidextrous, but it wasn't playable. But you want to know what? Again, in our games, we had DMs who were like, oh, okay, sure, you can do that.
Yeah, I did that. I mean, in first edition days, I had my players they were allowed to play drow. But yeah, I mean, it's there, the stat bonuses, there seems to be a focus on those from people. Like, I've run hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games at game stores and cons, and it always seems like there are those who are focused on stats and making a killing machine, and then there are those who are focused on story, and it's very difficult for those two groups of people to see eye to eye on what's important. So in terms of the stat bonuses, I think it's also important to remember for those because I've never seen this mentioned, and that is that if you're playing an orc and you have that -2 to intelligence, and if you subscribe to my theory that intelligence is book learning and wisdom is your real problem solving ability, if you subscribe to that, you could say, well, orcs don't live in a society that emphasize book learning, right? But they still have a maximum of 20 intelligence. So
They could learn.
They could learn. They could take those stat bumps and crank that intelligence up. Now,
Matt, do you see the problem though here? Because people just want it hand delivered to them. They don't want to have to like sacrifice adding to their intelligence when they could when they want to put it to their prime requisite for their class. Now, I played a half orc fighter who had a scholar background, and he was a bookworm and loved books. And I took my bonuses and I put them to his intelligence because he was well read and learned rather than going to strength, which would have benefited him as a fighter. See, and again, you can't be all things everybody, but so that goes back to my point. What's more important to the person playing? Is it more important that you are the greatest, or is it more important that you're diving into your character?
And I think the point I want to make, and Dan, you make this point, and I think everybody here has made this point, but the point I really want to make is that I think players forget, and as somebody who came from first edition where the negotiation between the DM and the player was a big deal because there were no skills, there were no,
yes.
So you had to be able to convince your DM, I really want to be really good at reading runes. I'm a fighter, but I really want to learn it, and so there's that negotiation. Well, I'm going to talk to this person. I'm going to, instead of spending my time practicing my sword, I want to do this or that. And I think that players should even in the 5e days should get comfortable with the idea that they could go to their DM and say, I want to play an orc, but I want to play an orc who is raised by halflings. And so rather than that -2 to intelligence, would it be okay if I don't take the bonus to strength, for example? Because that's not how I didn't spend my days learning to kill things and stomp on people's crops and be mean. Instead, I learned how to smoke pipeweed and hang out in the tavern and and that sort of thing, and have a give and take there. I think would be really interesting. I'm really interested. Everyone's had a chance. I want to take like a minute for everybody to kind of respond. So I'm going to ask Nasser what you had the disadvantage of going first. So all the folks had their say. I'm curious what you're thinking now.
I agree with everybody's point. Like everybody has made like a valid point. Malcolm, Hamid, and Dan, they all have great points. The one thing I want to say that I think Wizards have, like this debate we're having, I think they probably have listened to what people were talking about. So that's why you get in Tasha's, I think there's a section that deals with that. If you don't want to, let's say, play a certain race or species that way, you can change up the stats. I think that's a great point. Like it actually, like if somebody is unhappy with something, I think they've already given them the solution to actually deal with it in that book. Like you can go up to your DM, which kind of brings us to the same point you were talking about. You can go up to your DM and say, I don't want to play my orc this way. I want to play him this way, and I want to change up the stats because I feel that because of his backstory, he shouldn't be a certain way. They've given you the solution for the whole problem in that book.
I remember loving seeing that when Second Ed kind of did the 2.5 thing, if you will, with the black books, when WotC just bought out TSR at around that point, they started putting out the black cover books, and they included the series of books called the Player's Options, right? And so the Player's Options, I think it's called the Skills and Talents,
Skills and Powers. Yeah.
Skills and Powers. There you go. Thanks, Matt. And yeah, there was an option in there to completely, make your races bespoke, to suit your setting, to suit your play style, to suit what you wanted. And the reason I bring it up and not say, for example, Tasha's, is because, given the current, let's call it, the narrative of the era, it makes sense to do something like that. But back then, it was really, really progressive. It was almost like out of the blue, this opportunity rather, to be able to customize your races and build races from scratch, and they'd give you the building blocks to do it and stuff like that. It was quite a huge thing, I felt. I remember distinctly relishing that, and I used it more as a DM's tool to build my own kind of like creatures and races that are unique to specific regions of my world and stuff like that. And it was, loads of fun. I remember really liking it. And so to me, it makes sense that it kind of got refacilitated, for want of a better word, through Tasha's today, because players want those options, and I feel that it really does say, hey, look, you come from the slightly older school, you've got the core rules and they'll carry you. But if if these, let's call them more nuanced topics, matter to you, well, here's some options that you could use to incorporate that into your game. And I think that actually, it deserves a hat tip, what I'm saying, to WotC, simply because it's, I don't think if you want to talk about like issues or conversations on the internet, there's the topic of like, WotC selling out their older sort of the older gaming generation for the younger one, right? And I don't necessarily subscribe to that point of view. And I think that it's reflected in the content that they're putting out. At least that's my view on it.
Yeah, I remember the skills and powers book, because there was like advantages that you could apply to your character and disadvantages. So it was like, oh, my character's colorblind. I think all of my players took colorblind because they didn't think it would matter. And then you introduce color dependent puzzles and traps. But yeah, Malcolm, I definitely, you kind of like mentioned some things that I had never thought about before, and that is, the Western ideal. That's what D&D was built on, but that's what it was, a bunch of Mountain Dew swilling, licorice eating guys in Wisconsin who made the game. And Dan,
and I'm not mad at that. No, yeah, that's right.
No. And Dan mentioned they tried to dip into like OA and Alkadim and all that. And there are a lot of people who would say they did that poorly. And I think there's people here that would even say they did some of those things poorly. But on the same note, they still were the same Mountain Dew swilling guys in Wisconsin, right, who didn't even have the internet at the time. So they went and got books and they did what they could do, So what do you think, Malcolm? Do you think has anyone changed your mind? And do you think that there is an answer? Because one of the things, like my group, we tried 4th edition for about 6 months, and I remember mid-session somebody put the book down and they said, this doesn't feel like D&D to me. And I said, well, does everyone want to go back to 3rd edition? And everyone unanimously said yes. And so do you think that if they divert too much, and I know 4th edition fell flat, do you think if they divert too much, do you think that's going to cost them in the long run? And if so, what do you think the answer is?
First off, let me say, like what Hamad said, I completely agree that I think what we've all gone around and understood. Dan has said it, Nasir said it. We all play the game we want to play, especially as a DM. You can play this game however you want. So it is a moot point in a sense to argue that D&D is somehow pushing away its old players, because the old players who've been playing forever have tons of material. We could never run out of D&D, old school D&D material if we don't like 5th edition. That's why I guess I don't get upset with any of the changes of 5th edition. And I feel like the same arguments that I could use to argue for keeping those stats, those racial modifiers, I could use that same argument to get rid of them, right? And that's like what Nasir said in Tasha. It says it right there. Play it however you want. If you want to change this, if you want to negotiate this. So I think that WotC answered a call that people were asking for. And for this new edition, because this is like a super players driven version of 5th edition, that we probably the most player driven, they're all player driven, but
player friendly,
for player friendly, and leans on players being like, I always say like Marvel superheroes, like is what like 5th edition feels like versus sword and sorcery and dark and gritty. But with that, I can't even like kind of lost my point there. But like, yeah, I think like with that, they gave people what they want. I think a lot of the argument, if we want to stop having the argument, I think a lot of the argument, I have to put ownership on the old heads who are having the argument. Why are you changing the game? Games have to continue to change. And like Hamid said, it's hard to deal with change because suddenly you're like, I've been doing this for 5 years like this or 10 years like this. And now you want to say it's different, right? Right. And let me confirm. I don't think we should do away with negative race modifiers to monsters, right? So I see a kobold. Yeah, kobolds you find in a cave that are protecting a dragon should have those. But I guess my argument is my player is using Tasha's to play or one of the mini rule books to play a kobold that is not like those kobolds or is very different, then why would I balk at that book, right? Like when I first heard Tasha's was changing all this stuff, I was like, why? Then I'm like, does it make the players happy? Does it make my players happy? So what then, right? Like I have to let go of some of that stuff that I'm holding on to. But I do still think there are parts of me that on the other side, so that part's changed my mind. Like that's where I'm kind of with you all, right? Like, but I do still understand that there is part of this that is culture is so heavily cultural that it's hard for us sometimes to let go of certain things. So like when Dan says I played a samurai, so I had to make it make sense, right? Like why was this guy here in this kind of medieval setting? I think that I get that thinking, but I also get how people go, well, a lot of people playing this game are in America, very, very, very diverse places, right? And the game is the people playing the game are more diverse than ever, right? All of our groups are. I'm no longer sitting around playing the game with 6 guys, right? Just 6 men, right? I have a lot of female players now. I have a lot, and so with that diversity, with those different backgrounds, why would I not automatically start to change this kind of homogenized medieval world? And make it that like, why would it? It's different when you're watching TV shows that are based on books and stuff. We're playing fantasy. Why wouldn't my worlds be overly populated with different people? So that's just my thinking of it because my reality is that that's the way my world is. And I have a history for how it got this way, right? So we aren't playing ancient medieval Europe. It's based on that, right? But it's not that, right? That's why we have artificers that are making fake cannons and stuff, right? So I think I'm with you. I see points on both sides still. I think I'll probably continue to,
I'd like to say something that kind of ties Malcolm's last point with something Dan said earlier, actually, and that's that, when you're focused at your table on narrative as opposed to mechanics, right? And the players and you as a DM, you're taking on the feedback from, you're reading your table, you're taking on the feedback of the players, you're catering to the type of game that they want to play, and that's ultimately how you're all going to have fun together. There's no reason as a DM, even an old school DM, why you can't have fun with that narrative still. Because at the end of the day, right, even the very roots of like some of these, I use the term loosely, but let's call them monster races that became player races later, right? Like the half-orc, like the drow, like the Durgar, etc., and so forth. Even orcs and kobolds in later supplements. But like, when you get to become those characters, if you have zero cares, what I say about the stats and whether somebody should be smarter or stronger or less street smart or whatever it might be, if you have no quibbles and qualms about that, there's still this implicit understanding that the players are the protagonists of the story now. And so if they are playing something exceptional above and beyond, what typifies that species, they are the proverbial Dritzdordens, they are the Dritzdordens of those particular species. And that is a very welcome thing, or should be a very welcome thing at the table, because that's a unique narrative as well. I, as a DM, would double down on the bastardism. You know what I'm saying? I would create that juxtaposition intentionally to reinforce the narrative that you are the exception to the norm if you're playing a monstrous race. I wouldn't let my lich have wheelchair-friendly ramps for that wheelchair sporting character. You know what I'm saying? Because part of overcoming those challenges are going to be exactly what are going to make that player feel so rewarded from that experience when they overcome.
The hero's journey. The hero's journey.
Yeah.
The hero's journey. Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, The only other thing I really have to offer to the idea is, I think, and I only just learned about this. I only just found out about this, so this is kind of funny. But do you guys know about Thaco the Clown?
Yeah.
And how some people saw that as a dig to the old school gamers. You know, and I again, I don't spend a lot of time, but I did go on Facebook, and I did find in like the first edition groups, there's a lot of people are like, that fifth edition, you know. So I see what you're saying, Malcolm, about you know, where are the arguments coming from? And I see right now that it's kind of coming from all directions. You know, there are some people, I've seen some people argue, well, if you've got a human race who is at war with an elvish race, that's a problem. You know, you can't have that. And then on the flip side, there are people like, if you don't have conflict, that's a problem. You know, but for my little private world, I am very guilty of homogenizing groups. So like, I have a nation that's kind of like part Mongolian, part Japanese, part Chinese, kind of in culture. But I didn't want to make like an entire world. I wanted to make a continent for people to live on. And if I tried to get too deep into the rabbit hole, I would spend my entire life creating this world, you know. So I wanted something that because I had players that were well versed in Japanese culture, had been there, you know, and spent time over there, and so I was like, well, I want some surprises for them, so I didn't want to make it purely Japanese. And so, you know, I introduced parts of largely Mongolian. My wife is part Mongolian, so it was kind of like a thing where she's like a pillager, you know, kind of Genghis Khan style. But you know, some people see that as like a cardinal sin to do something like that.
I don't think that. I don't see it as a negative thing to do. I think though it is a product of constantly seeing the world in a certain way, and that's the way you write your world. That's okay. I think it's very realistic and so forth. I think a lot of times what I've seen growing up over my lifespan is just things like, even in like movies like Star Wars or in my art, you find that someone is trying to write a new culture, and then I'm trying to give them breadth. I'm trying to make them feel real. So, what do? I look through history and I choose one, and then I apply it to those people. And then this is where it gets a little weird. I don't like the word problematic. I just think it gets a little annoying, right? When you're watching a movie and you're like, this entire culture in this sci-fi world is clearly based on like, inspired by like Japanese culture, but they've got big eyes and tentacles. Like suddenly they just became another weird race, but you just kind of reskinned an entire culture. And that is how I think over time you make these mistakes. I think they're mistakes because they don't make, more than making people upset, I just think it becomes like bad world building when you just kind of, it's just kind of like, come on, man, that's what you did. That was the easy out to create a new culture. And I'm not saying you do that, Matt. I'm saying that's what I see a lot of when I'm reading, when I'm watching stuff, and that makes me mad. It's not me going, oh, I want social justice for these people, or you can't have slavery in your game, or there should be no conflict between races. And no, I actually think that makes a world more real. But when you see it and it's cringy. And I've just found more of the players that I play with that are of diverse backgrounds tend to see it easier. And then my players who are not, or, are like going like, what's the big deal? Right. It's just weird that there exists this two ways of, it's like, no, I see it all the time. And like, Hamad Nasser said, I think we the way you read any story, your background, your experiences are going to play into your perception of what you're seeing there. And so in that regard, I think sometimes writers can, or in our world building, we can do a better job of that, of like making the world a little bit more diverse in a unique way, right? Rather than just being like,
if I may kind of like add to Malcolm's point, right? So there's an important distinction between two separate tasks that we have to draw here, right? So the act of world building and borrowing liberally from this wealth of information that we have today and access to information that we have today about cultures we may have never even visited, You're saying, and to use elements from that in our own world building, even if we're mixing and matching and, you know, just sort of really creating this semi-sensible jigsaw that just sounds fantastic, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, clever plagiarism is arguably the root of all creative writing anyway, right? The thing is, that should be differentiated. The act of doing it, nothing wrong with it. In fact, I think everybody should do it, in my honest opinion, right? Have at it, borrow liberally from what the world has to offer, what different cultures have to offer, because they're wonderful, and, you know, Frankenstein something together that's uniquely yours, and you know, have fun with it. But the thing is, the act of doing it is a natural process of world building to my mind. But executing it well and doing it in a way that's not kitsch, or even, you know, borderline or cross that borderline outright offensive. You know what I'm saying? That's a learned skill. That's,
you know what?
That's somebody telling stories. You know what I mean?
I used to like I didn't mind actually 4th edition. I loved all editions. I don't engage in edition wars because I've had great campaigns in each of them. During 4th edition, Chris Perkins used to have a weekly column that I absolutely love. You can go and download it. It's the DM experience. It's really worthwhile. It doesn't matter that it was in 4th edition. It was just great DM advice in there. And like one article he devotes to accents and you know, the importance of differentiating NPCs. So I mean, you know, whether you're good at it or not, it's just to differentiate NPCs for your players. And for example, like, you know, he was talking about how like some characters have New York City accents. He tends to do his drow with Jamaican accents. And is he trying to say that drow are Jamaican? No, he's just doing that to create a little distinction for his players when he hears them, so that they know when there's a Jamaican accent that is most likely drow. And just he like, so, but his whole idea about borrowing all these different accents and taking them is something great. I mean, you know, like for example, whenever I run an Eberron campaign, almost every watch commander or inquisitive, you know, in the city of Sharn is going to talk, you know, like he's from New York City. And, you know, so like, I'll do the same thing. I'll borrow that. To Matt's point about that I really like, because it really rekindled some old feelings of nostalgia, was the negotiating with the DM. And, you know, and I agree with you all about the Tasha's. Tasha's answered it fine. But long before Wizards of the Coast or you know, was telling us, oh, these things were possibilities, DMs and players were making it happen. Back in 1st edition, you couldn't be a halfling who was an illusionist. But man, I wanted to be a thief illusionist halfling. So I talked to my DM and he was like, okay, well, how about this? Not that it affected the gameplay, but I had a quarter gnome in my bloodline. And that was how I could do it. I had one gamer, he wanted to be a druid, but he didn't want to be a particular race. And there was a creature called a bark burr, which is a vegetable. It arises spontaneously from vegetable matter. And that's the druid he was. So this negotiation with the DM is important. And again, any of those things, and I think we're all on the same page here, is anything that pushes and advances the story. I mean, I don't care. Like when I have a gamer at the table talking about the mechanics and how he can do this or that. Oh, if I don't care. Stop talking to me about that. That bores me to tears. Role play your character. Tell me how the story's impacted you. Tell me how you're going to impact the story, how you're going to contribute. These are the things that are important and most important. And I think that's the beauty. That's really the beauty of the game. And if people aren't playing it that way, I think they're really missing out at the heart of what it can be.
Yeah. I have a very funny story to add to Dan's point, actually. So way back in the day, we used to play Dragonlance in 2nd edition. And it's a wonderful, wonderful setting and a wonderful game. Yeah. And I remember one of my players, and this just goes to exemplify how resistant I was to like ideas back at the time, right? We're talking 20 plus something years ago here. And this player came up to me and he said, I'd really like to play a Kender Wild Mage. And I just flat out said no. Yeah, I was the DM at the table. I flat out said no, and I denied this. And over multiple campaigns, this poor guy would always come back to me and say, "I want to play a Kender Wild Mage. I want to play a Kender Wild Mage." And then, you know, fast forward many years, come to the present, and you know, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have heard the announcement that Dragonlance may be coming up in 5e. And to me, I'm personally very excited about that. But interestingly enough, that same player is with me in a WhatsApp chat group where we kind of call it the Global Gaming Guild because we're situated everywhere in the world and we try to meet online to play. And sort of he reaches out to me, he says, Ham, you know, the Dragonlance is, you know, 5e, you're going to do Dragonlance. You know? I was like, yeah, wow, that's really cool. And I kind of deviated away from 5e over the last period because, you know, I just want to try out other systems kind of things. So I've been playing 5e less and less. And I was like, and I wrote down in the chat, I was like, yeah, you know, Dragonlance would be a good reason for me to sort of dive back into 5e and run a long-term campaign. And then he asks the question, can I play that Kender Wild Mage now? We were teenagers when he asked me that question the first time, and now we're in our mid-40s. And I said, you know what, no. Man? I said, absolutely, you can.
That'd be a great way to end the story. I said no.
Actually, hand on heart, I apologized to the guy, and I said, you know what? Great. If you want to play a Kender Wild Mage, that's exactly what you want to do. I mean, we're at an age now where it's about making those little childhood fantasies happen. You know what I'm saying? So do it. Have at it. I promise you know, on a Kender Wild Mage farm.
Ham, that's actually I'm gonna keep that story in mind when we go into the next question about you know, things we've learned, right?
Yeah.
You know.
Can I one thing I also like to I always take this approach and apply this to my games especially when I'm playing in one of like the 5th edition universes, whether it be Eberron or whatever. As DMs, we're kind of like, you know, many gods of our world and our table. But we take this script, we call these modules and these books, and we take them as like gospel, right? But like, even when it comes to the world, everything that is written has truths and has nuances. And so why are we so beholden to it sometimes? So for example, in one of my Waterdeep Dragon Heist games, they meet Volo, right? So I make it where Volo's book is coming out. So they're so excited to get Volo's book because then if they get it, they can reference the actual monsters and know things about them in the world. And just to give them a sense of doubt, I go, what if Volo was wrong? Like, what makes us know that Volo knows how much of Volo's? I like to add real. So if you want to add reality, I think Volo he's one man. He has to have biases. So does Mordecai, right? So what if they got it wrong? What if all the chromatic dragons are supposed to be evil, but they're only evil because of something kind of crazy that happened in the past that we don't know about? That's not in one of these. And that's what we're supposed to do at DMs, right? Like change the lore, throw things in there.
Yeah.
But the players always kind of that. I think that's the thing is we approach it that way in a weird way. It's like, but we're interpreting these gospels and there might be halflings are it's okay for the kobolds to have -2 whatever charisma, but maybe when whoever was writing about them, or every time people meet them, they kind of see them that way, so they kind of project that the kobolds are really stupid because around humans they look stupid, but if you were to see them like in their home territory, you would really get to see like, whoa, how they operate and how they keep all of this going, how they like work with this red dragon in this, you know, in this cavern. So I like to think of it that way. And I also think of the story, last thing I'll say before we move on to the next, is we always keep going back to it's the player's game. And so I always like to give them a little bit of ownership. So a lot of times when players are talking about their cultures and where they're from, I ask them, instead of referencing the book, whether they're a halfling or whatever, what did they do in your village, right? Like, what do they do where you're from? What is the name of that place? And then put that place in my world. I like to think of it as they are, because I think I see the player and the DM and the actual story as 3 parts. Like I always tell my players, you are playing a character, so therefore you are kind of controlling it, but you're also this audience. You're also this third party that is watching yourself on this journey, and that person has some agency that they get to add to the story. You know,
it's that cooperative storytelling,
absolutely,
which makes it that much richer. And then, you know, to your point about you know, kind of switching things up, like what did Volo really know? I think it's important to upend things, you know, in the game, because a lot of our players have been playing, at least even if they've been playing a year, they're already like, you know, experts, right? So you have to take the conventions and you have to turn them on end so that you can constantly surprise your players, give them something new. They expect one thing, and then you keep them kind of off balance in a good way, so that like you're keeping it fresh all the time. I
agree. I 100% agree with that. So yeah,
I think we've figured out that everybody's right. It's okay to there's some people that love tradition and they don't want to see anything change, and that's okay. And there's some people that are eager to like make it their own and make it different, and that's okay too.
I think just to add to your point, Matt, I think we were talking about D&D. The table is big enough for everybody. The narrative teller table, the power gamers table, the people that only like to dungeon delve. And I've played with all type, and it's what you and your group like. So it's big enough for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, I as a
Except
DM,
nobody likes the rules lawyer.
Nobody likes rules lawyer.
I agree.
You know, I have a page that I have, like, because I have 5 players in my group right now, and so like on this page I have, you know, Mira's story and everybody's story laid out, right? So what's going on with, because it's easy to get lost in, and especially if you have a quiet player, you know, it's easy to like leave them in the dirt and just push that story forward. But I can see it's being a DM is a lot of work, you know, if you want to do it right. And that kind of leads us into the next questions. And I'm going to kind of condense them together because we spent an hour on that first question. And they kind of go together. This is from a young lady. She is 13, and she has been sending me questions and about her game that she runs for her little group of friends. She's got 2 players.
That's awesome.
And but she's in Europe, and as a minor, I'm not going to give any names or login information or anything, but she asked 2 questions, and I thought we could put them together as one. What were some mistakes you made as a DM that taught you important lessons? And what makes a game memorable?
All right. Right on.
So
Those
Dan,
are such awesome questions.
we'll go in reverse order. Dan.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've been looking forward to this one because I can address a wrong that I committed. You know, I played for many years before I really was a regular DM. And so saying no out of the gate because I wasn't prepared or because something didn't make sense to me, saying no to a player. And you know, that if to an idea like, oh, is it possible for me to do this? And maybe I didn't think of something or have something prepared, so I'm just like, oh no, that's not, no. Like, man, I've learned that is a terrible thing to say to a player. You know, because and not just a player, but for you as a DM too, to say that you're closing down a story avenue. And what I've learned that is way better is to always say yes. Now, that doesn't mean giving the player exactly what they want. You say, yes, and, you know, yes, and they get what they want, but there may be consequences, there may be something. I instead of saying no, always say yes, and have it lead in a direction that drives the story forward, helps the characters have opportunities to you know, further develop their character and deepen their involvement in the role playing. You know, sometimes it leads to good things, sometimes their yes may lead to complications, but as long as any of the complications is that branch storytelling that continues to push the story forward, you're in a good place, and you'll create some of the most memorable moments. You know, so don't say no. Don't be afraid to say yes. You know, don't worry that you aren't prepared for that yes. Take a moment. Say, oh, okay, yes. Just give me a moment. I want to run and get a bottle of water or use the bathroom or something, and then think about it for a second. Or if you feel uncomfortable doing that, say, yes, you know what? Let's take a pause here. I want to think about this. No player is going to be upset with you. They're going to be like, okay, they care enough about the story and about what I want to try and do that they want to give this thought. You know, so that's a pretty short answer, but that one is one I really regret saying a few times because I missed out on great opportunities for the story and for that character. What makes a memorable thing? The stuff people talk about. I have to tell you, a couple games that, like, I know my players are still going on and talking about are the things that have to do, like, where, man, dice were hardly even rolled. It was all story driven.
Uh-oh.
Because you along the way of the campaign, you continue to make investments in the story. You continue to make the players feel invested, emotionally invested, you know, and I mean, where there's people actually like crying at the table. I mean, like that kind of experience is the stuff that lasts. A great battle, a battle where the players, it came down to one player left standing with 1 hit point, and the monster they're fighting had 1 hit point, and who was gonna win. It came down to initiative. But I've also done things where I've had, you know, the characters, I let them come in and basically sweep through hordes of monsters that were so low hit points that they just felt like incredibly empowered, you know. So it's those balances of, I found a balance of encounters, hardcore story, emotional driven stuff, you know, whether it was funny or sad or just like uplifting. Those moments very memorable. The moments where they fought a pitched battle and nearly lost, that's memorable. The ones where they came in like superheroes and swept through, those are memorable. I don't know that there's one specific answer, but I think when you're all laughing, when you're all jazzed and just all excited about the story, those are the times, those are the moments, and you don't always get that right, which helps make those, when you get those moments right, that much more memorable.
Yeah,
there you go.
I think what you're basically saying is the struggle, triumphing over the struggle, and struggle could take an infinite number of skins, if you will. It can appear in so many different ways. But yeah, Ham.
Real fast, Matt. Let me just add real fast. I think, you know, one of the things too, how to make it memorable and get people invested is making consequences, right? Good and bad consequences, like for the players' actions. Like everything we do in our own world has consequences, you know, and some are good and some are bad, you know, and that applies in the game too. Like you can't just go into a village and, you know, because the guard wants to arrest you and you burning hands them and kill them, you know, you may have left you know, widows behind and orphans and things like that. And those kind of consequences, making it be confronted in the story, deep in the story, make the whole experience rewarding and memorable.
Ham.
Other than the mistake about the Kender Wild Mage and saying no outright, Dan is absolutely right. Yes, and is a great way to kind of approach how players can possibly engage with you and get invested in your game. Another mistake that I made in my early years as a DM was over planning my sessions. So it would be very helpful to you if you just took this journey of DMing your players, knowing that you will never ever be able to plan for every single contingency, that there will always be that situation where a player will take you by surprise and go in the complete opposite direction of what you had prepared for the day. And the alternative that I can suggest for you that could be really, really helpful is engage with your players and get their investments. And this actually also answers the second half of the question, how to make games really, really memorable, right? So the struggle of overcoming adversity, as Matt sort of eloquently summarized earlier, is a very powerful tool. Players will remember that. But I would actually go so far as to simplify that even more. I would say that players will not remember the mechanics of the game, but they'll always remember how you made them feel during the game, especially when an encounter gets rounded up, you know, when it reaches its conclusion. And if you remember that, I think you're always going to be on the right path. Although the learning how to do that successfully in your games is an acquired skill. It'll take you time, and you may make a few mistakes along the way. But I think I can help you with some tips and guidelines on how to make that happen. And this goes to something that Dan was saying. Getting the players invested into your story is an important thing. And this will both help you get the players invested in their characters and for you to kind of structure your story and cater to your players at the same time. Don't be afraid to conduct an interview with your players and get them to put their character's hat on and ask them questions like this. Let's say it's a starting game, right? Tell me where you're from, name the place, tell me the one thing that you remember the most fondly about it, tell me one thing that you dislike about it, okay? And now they've created a place for you. They've created a setting. They've given you a starting village. You know what I'm saying? And then that's something that you can build off of in your game. 2, ask the players, all characters that start at first level were technically level 0 before that, right? That's where the backgrounds come in 5e, okay? And before that, they were children. So ask them these 3 questions. Say, what is your fondest memory as a child growing up in said, enclave that they're starting it? And what is your worst memory over there? Always contrast the 2, best and worst memories, right? And then say, when you picked up your profession, what was your greatest achievement then? And what was your worst memory of that period? And then do the same for first level. What made you decide to embrace that class? Okay. And what is the small thing that you've done that you find most, that you're most proud of, right? And let's say you're starting, for example, with characters that are a little higher level and they've already picked their archetypes. They're second level or third level or something like that. Same nature of the questions. What made you choose that path? What are you proud of achieving, et cetera, and so forth? What is your fondest memory of that time, or your, the single standout memory for that time? And questions like that, going through this little player interview, what it does is it pushes the player to think a little bit outside their comfort zone and to dig deep into their character. And when the players understand their characters, they are now living and breathing those characters. You will be rewarded in spades in terms of their level of engagement in your game. And more importantly, you as the DM, you'll be able to take that information you've just facilitated for yourself to be able to take all that information that they've given you about themselves, about their history, about their family. Use Xanathar's Guide. My God, it's got some fantastic tables and questions to answer these things, right? I definitely recommend it very strongly. It's actually hands down my favorite supplement out of everything WotC released so far. But yeah, just go ahead and ask them these questions. And then you've got all these tools to basically start structuring your game where you are tailor-making it for those specific characters. And so segueing from that, that's hopefully, I should say, a good starting point. But going back to the point about don't over-prepare for your games, probably the most valuable skill you could learn as a DM is being able to read the table and take the cues from your players and pivot immediately and turn those into storytelling opportunities. Now, that's easier said than done, and it should be something, I think, for a starting DM to keep in mind and work towards in the long term. Never feel embarrassed if you make a mistake or if a session doesn't go the way as planned, or if you try something and it doesn't quite work out. In the long run, it'll all even out and you'll just keep getting better at it. But keep it at the forefront of your mind. That's definitely what I would recommend.
Right on.
Malcolm.
How do you follow Dan and Hamid? That's like that crash course right there is everything you need, right? I think what I would really be just adding to those building blocks that they have set before. I guess the first part of it is what is something that I've done that was like a big stake early on when I was DMing. And I think one of the things I ran into is I always knew the importance of have a session 0, which I think a lot of what Hamid covers and Dan covers in there is having that conversation with your players, ask them those questions, learn about their characters, let that influence your world. Also set a precedence for the tone of the story that you plan to try to tell, right? I think my biggest mistake is once I had a game that developed naturally, we were just playing all these different one-shots that kind of turned into a campaign. It was super high level. And then one of my players did something that kind of led them into the Shadowlands, and which took us into the Shadowfell, where I was like, this is a perfect chance to just kind of go into Curse of Strahd. And I've been wanting to run that for a long time. But suddenly the campaign has shifted. So my tone, I didn't set the right precedence where I saw it coming. The game suddenly went from high fantasy to brutal, and so brutal. And that was in retrospect, as a kind of world builder and the person running that story, I should have set more clues. I should have made it more clear as they were making those decisions. So sometimes a session 0 can can set the presence for, you know, what can happen in the story, what we may get into, what we may, how you know, strong, what to expect just from the world. It doesn't mean you have to reveal secrets, right? You just want to say, this is the type of story I want to tell. I think I want it to be high fantasy, or I think I want it to be kind of dark and scary, right? For your friends. So they know, okay, it's going to be a dark and scary world. I got to prepare a character that's going to be able to survive and be ready for a dark and scary world. So I think that's one thing in terms of addressing something that I've done in the past. And I think about just making memorable stories to just add to having those memorable games is to, like Hamid said, is don't over plan and don't be so hard on yourself if you're still learning certain rules and you're trying to learn certain races, or you're even trying to come up with things. Sometimes your inspiration just won't be there, but that's where you use the collaborative storytelling at the table. Use your players, feed off of them, and they will inspire you at the table. And one way to keep learning too, so that you don't overcomplicate the game, is to choose one rule or one thing that you want to get better at, and you read it, and then you say, I'm going to use that somewhere in this session, right? Like, I don't quite understand like jumping rules, but I'm going to make sure I somewhere in here, I think they're in the wilderness. So I think I can have them jump at some point, right? And I can use that in a game. I think those, and then in addition to that, I think the last thing is, I think what's supposed to be said before everything is there, is you really will learn it. And when you have those core principles of knowing who the characters are, you start using their background, you start using people they meet and who go away, and you start going, ooh, this NPC, this guard that they met, that they kind of did him wrong. I had planned for this. I have this, you know, don't be afraid to change your plans. Like, I planned for this to be my big bad, but suddenly this guard that they've wronged seems like a better big bad in the long run, and they might not see him coming, right? And that will be a bigger reveal. It'll be a bigger shock than this like big bad you tried to write this crazy overarching like lore and backstory for. So yeah, I think that's all I can really say. In the memorable moments, they'll just come. The more you do it, the more you play, especially with your friends. You guys it will bond, it will gel, and just keep at it.
And certainly don't feel bad about telling your players in session 0 that I'm learning too.
Yes.
You know, and that's okay. That way you kind of manage their expectations ahead of time, and you know, it's okay to make mistakes. You're all learning together, so to speak. Sorry, no.
I am constantly asking my players, what does that spell do? And I'm like, I should know what that spell does. Like,
you know, adding real quick, I just wanted to say something, you know, because Malcolm was talking about NPCs. Don't be afraid to let your players do the heavy lifting too. Like, if they say you're in a town and they're like, oh, I want to go, I want to find somebody in the street and talk to them. I said, okay, describe to me. Tell me who it is you find. What do they look like? How do they talk? And suddenly they give you a springboard to jump off on, and that also becomes memorable because they are invested in that world building with you.
Yes.
Yeah. Agreed 100%.
Nasser, you're a tough act to follow.
Yeah, I agree with like I kind of like, and this, like all three of us, I think, especially like Ham, we all use the same methods in like in running our game. So just to talk about something that I feel like I've done wrong and I kind of learned from it, I used to railroad a lot. And like I used to force players into a certain path, and what you're doing there is you're taking away the joy of them discovering the world, because you're putting them on this path because you have a story in your mind where it's going to start here and it's going to end over there, and this is the main bad guy. So what I started doing before, like even before starting a campaign, I'd ask the players, what type of campaign do you guys want to play? And going back to the point that Dan was saying, feed off your players. This is what helps you create the story as you go on. Yes, you have a setting for the story. You know who the bad guy is, but don't be afraid, like Malcolm said, to change up that bad guy and move to somebody else. If based on the player's actions are what leads you to the story. You're the GM, you set the setting, you set the scene, but I think the players by the end of the day are the heroes of the story. And talking about memorable campaigns, I think I'm going to take a step back a bit from everybody. Before session 0, right, is the players themselves. Let's say you're a new DM and you're about to start a new campaign with a new group of players. Before getting to those memorable moments, you have to make sure that the players at the table have synergy. Because if you don't have synergy before getting to session 0, you won't have memorable moments. You'll have probably arguments on the table, and a lot of that's going to happen. So the best thing to do is to, if you have a group of players, is to run them in multiple one-shots, or maybe, you know, like 3 sessions, just to see how they play with each other, how they work with you as a DM. Because by the end of the day, it's like you can have the greatest role players on the table, but if there's no DM to player compatibility, or even player to player compatibility, campaigns like can fall apart in one session, and I've seen that happen. So I think that's a good point to start with. Run a group of players, and maybe sometimes you might not even synergize with your own friends. So look for other players that could actually synergize with you on the table and synergize with each other. So I feel that's a very like important point before even starting the campaign and doing the session 0. As far as the session 0 stuff that everybody here said, that's all gold. I agree with it 100%. That session 0 is what leads you to those memorable moments. And Dan was talking about something which I call the sweet spot. Like I think you talked about it role playing. See, the sweet spot for me, and I was talking to other game masters or DMs about it, is like you could be sitting back and the players are the ones leading the scene and role playing a scene in front of you. I call that the DM's sweet spot, because you're just sitting there and you're enjoying what you're seeing. It's like you're watching a movie. I think that's part of it. And what Dan mentioned about combat and what everybody else said, I agree with it 100%. I think that's my point on that.
There's an interesting, you brought up a really cool point there, actually. So it took about 30 years before I found myself in a session with a group of younger players who surprised the heck out of me in a long-term campaign that we had, because over the course of that campaign, we must have played like well over like 20 plus sessions, right? They surprised the heck out of me because we had at least, and I kid you not, I'm not exaggerating, at least 5 sessions out of those, 20 something odd games that were purely dialogue. I was a spectator at my own game, at my own table. And it wasn't meaningless dialogue. It was in-character dialogue that was driving the narrative of the story forward. And they were doing it completely in character at the time. And that shocked the heck out of me. And I think that's something very rare. I don't think that happens at every table.
Yeah,
You know what? You know what I did? I got tired of doing long bits of travel in my campaign, where it was like, oh, you're going for a month, 2 months. And so what I started doing was I was like having each character going around the table and telling me what happened during that travel. And then when we got into this big dungeon crawl inside an old dwarven homeland, I said, okay, guys, here's the deal. I want each of you to write up a story that you can tell within 5 to 10 minutes of, 3, 4, 5 days of your time in the mountain. It's got to be consistent with the campaign. It's got to be consistent with how the other characters are. You can't do anything to embarrass the other characters. No, no punking out the other characters. Got to be consistent. And I sat back as these guys all wove stories, and it was so entertaining to sit back and hear them. And because the campaign had been immersive, and because they had been playing together for so long, they were consistent with the stories. And so basically, like for like 2.5 hours, I was just sitting there, and and it was just that role playing. So that's a really cool thing. I also encourage that sort of thing, so that, like, don't get mired into, a month of travel and you're just like, okay, rolling constantly to see how the weather is. How's the weather today? Get them to tell you things. Oh, we're looking for a tavern. Oh, tell me what you find,
Yeah, not everything has to be a hex crawl.
Yeah. To add to Dan's point, your main villain in the campaign could be given to you by a player, by someone they describe that probably
happens all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. But they like, you could be having trouble. Like, what am I going to throw at them? This is a cool campaign, but I don't know who the main bad guy is. Then one of the players like, oh, this is what happened to me in throughout my life when I was a young child, or when I was a young lad. And then he gives you your villain. You're like, okay, that's the guy I've been looking for to fill in that villain role.
Hey, so the point about railroading, right? Here's another little dirty DM secret. We all have them. Is the invisible railroad? They make it seamless. Like, you have some things planned. You don't have to be locked into it. But if you know they need to go that way, make it seem like it's their choice. Like they come to a fork in the road and you have things planned for the right path, not the left path, and they go the left path. Well, just have the same thing happen. It seems like it was their choice. So and that's and we all know that. But like, if you're new at this, that's something that you don't think about, and you get so rigid and fixed into what you had. I find that the more I plan, the better equipped I am for improvisation. So, and I know, like, some people it might be the opposite. Then you get like locked into what you plan. But the more I plan, for me, that means I've got that there, but I can go totally off book better than ever if I have that.
I can flip the dungeon if I wanted to. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Malcolm.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think another thing that helps is if you're playing multiple sessions, if you get into a rhythm with your players, you'll kind of start to notice, like, we play for 3 hours, or we play for 4 hours, and you'll start to know a big portion of planning your next episode is kind of knowing where to end it. I am not gonna lie, I take a Netflix binge approach to almost every session, to where I am trying to end every session to where they're like, why are we ending here? Right? Like, why is this where we should be stopping? Because sometimes it's great. Sometimes if you end on a combat, at least you have that first hour to set up and start that combat from jump, and then you can tailor a couple of different choices that you can kind of plan for. And then even if they take you off the railroad, you're going to probably get at least an hour of your time, of your session, what you want there. And I think another thing is, like, all of us have said it too, is like, be afraid to take a break during the game. Playing online, one of the greatest like rewards I've had is I can take a break. I will be on Zoom. I can put myself on mute and turn off and then I can just sit there for 5 minutes and listen to them talk. And they'll just give me they'll give me plots and places. They'll make up people. Because think about when you read a book or you watch a movie, there's something really rewarding about trying to guess what's going to happen next. And when that one player was like, I told you that was going to happen. I told you he was going to do that. Like, sometimes you grab one of those things, or you grab it, you change it just enough to where they were like, I almost had it right. When it was like, you had it right, because I made it up because of you. You can do that kind of stuff, and it's great.
Yep. Totally.
Players like to feel right.
Yes.
I think that somebody said earlier to listen to their players, and that's big, but I also like to watch their reactions. Like, you're going to throw dozens and dozens of NPCs at players over the span of however long your campaign is. And, as soon as I see the party reacting the way I want them to react to an NPC, whether it's, their laughter or anger or whatever, I immediately know that I have a recurring NPC right there. Yeah. And I remember one of my biggest mistakes was I had planned a campaign. I was like so pumped for this campaign. And I spent a year and a half trying to force feed this particular villain down their throats. And they were just like lukewarm about him. And I could tell, like, they just, no matter what he did, it didn't matter. And then I had a player character die, and the villain resurrected him, but it was kind of like Tolkien-esque with a fell spirit kind of inhabiting the body. And that set them off. And it wasn't the villain. It was because this fell spirit was having this XPC doing the worst things possible. And I immediately knew, well, there's my villain. So suddenly the villain of the campaign shifted to this XPC, and it turned into one of my most memorable campaigns they just hated this guy. I knew I had it right when we stopped one night playing, and my wife was mad at me. She was playing, and she's just like, I can't believe you would have him do that. I'm like, that's what he would do.
It's great.
You know.
Yeah.
I remember I was running a Curse of Strahd campaign for one of my groups, and it's probably the campaign I've run the most in D&D 5e actually. And they had these two guides, without spoilers in the game. They had these two huntsmen that were guides, sort of showing them around Barovia and stuff like that. And there was this particular scene where the huntsmen were kind of sent to discreetly go back to a particular town because the players were going to be too recognizable and they wanted to discreetly resupply, basically. And so they sent the huntsmen to do it. But the huntsmen were intercepted by these werewolves that were trying to track down the PCs. And so when the werewolves obviously tied these guys up and started, prodding and torturing them a little bit, trying to find out where the PCs are. In the meantime, the PCs realized that these guys were late, and so something must be up, and so they used some spells and magical items that they had or whatever, and they somehow managed to find and scry on what was going on over there. And now keep in mind that over the course of the campaign, of course, I'm building up Strahd to be the big bad, and it's the ultimate battle, etc. and so forth, as is appropriate in that game. This group, whenever you leave them to their own ends, they're arguing with each other, they're setting plans, the plans would eat up a lot in the game, and it was kind of like, it was this really insane dynamic that they had. But when they scried on those huntsmen, and they asked me what they saw, and I role-played a scene where one of the huntsmen, the archer, got his finger cut off to force him to confess and say, reveal where the players are. The guys got so riled up that they completely, for once, just put aside all their differences, rallied, and went on a rampage to slaughter these werewolves. And it was just, they went ballistic. It was the only time in that entire campaign where unilaterally they were single-minded about one thing, and it was justice for this guy that was sitting there losing body parts while fighting these guys off, saying, I'm not going to tell you where my comrades are. And that hit them so hard, that really hit them so hard. It was a slaughter, and it was probably one of the most, I would say, rewarding scenes in that game. But I mean, again, this all goes back to what the guys were saying, like, and you feed off like kind of what's happening, you create kind of situations, and the players will surprise you with what they consider is important, what they consider is fair, and what they consider, where their own barometer for their sense of justice and what's right is. And then they're going to act on it appropriately. And it falls to you to kind of feed off that. Now, I do want to add one thing that, I really believe everything that everybody said here is valid, but I also recognize maybe to some degree it doesn't give you actual tools to work with. So one of the things that that helped me a lot as a starting DM is random tables. So random tables oftentimes are misunderstood, or they're interpreted to be random encounter tables. That's not necessarily the case. There are a lot of resources out there. Like if you're stuck, if you have to come up with an NPC on the spot, or your players are stuck trying to answer that question of, well, you tell me what they say, you tell me what they look like. Let's say that it causes some kind of stall in the game, right? There are ample tools, ample table generators and NPC generators online that you can use to create towns, to create NPCs, to create items, to create names and things like that. These things, use them liberally. They're there to help you. And when you start using them enough, you're going to stop needing them, because you're going to have this library that you accumulate over time, and you'll be able to kind of do it yourself. So I would say that maybe random tables are a very good resource for DMs. And lastly, sorry, Dan.
Yeah, no, go on.
And lastly, if you're really a beginner and you kind of have hesitations or doubts about how well you can run a game, don't be afraid. Don't think that you have to shoulder all the responsibility yourself, right? There are loads of like first level games that have already been pre-written. Take them and run them as they are, or make them yours and, just sort of, again, do your own thing with them. But they will give you food for ideas, or fuel, for ideas, for places, for NPCs. And you may not even use the game. You may just use the place and the NPCs from there and things like that.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Every DM under the sun has done it at some point, and that's totally okay. All right. So I would say go ahead and use the resources that are already out there to help you, from existing modules and games to random table generators and things like that. That I think could be very, very helpful to you, and it'll start shaping kind of your skill set at DMing.
And don't be discouraged, particularly when you are new to DMing and with new gamers. When you are young, be prepared that it will be could be a largely thankless job. It for many years it was I know it was thankless for the DMs that I had, because I took them for granted. I demanded much of them, and it wasn't until I really was doing it that I realized, like, the amount of work. Your players will come to understand that eventually if they don't out of the gate. But the DM is like the unicorn. It's somebody who's like, that's why you hear the term forever DM, and as it happened, and you know what, I wasn't for many years, and now I am, but I prefer it to playing.
I do too.
Yeah, same. Definitely.
Yeah, I think that's all spot on advice, and I hope she enjoyed. I sent her a message saying that we're talking about her questions now and to look for this soon.
Cool.
But I think that the last piece of advice I could give is, I know that there's a lot of emphasis on session 0 and asking your players, what kind of game would you want to be in? I think that a lot of players are just happy to play. And I think that DMs shouldn't be afraid, because DMs should have fun too, to say, this is the kind of game I would like to play. Are you guys interested in that? And I think 9 times out of 10, they're all going to say, yeah, I just want to play, and so my preference is a grittier, like a horror setting kind of thing. And so over the years, I've never had any objections to running it that way. And I think that most players are in that. But, every once in a while you will have a player that wants to, that do want to play a particular character a certain way. And, I really want to play a giant slaying ranger with this backstory. And of course that might not fit into your pirate campaign, so you might make some allotments, giant triremes running down the coast, but yeah, I think this is all real good advice. And I want to thank you guys all for coming on again. I have multiple Word docs with questions backlogged, so we've got to do this again.
For sure.
I know that Brian and Ray want in, and there's some other folks that I want to bring in, but we're going to start mixing and matching. So look for more of these in the future, where we answer more questions from you folks out there, mostly through Instagram. Although I do have a Facebook page that I get some interesting tidbits from. But thank you all, Dan and Nasser and Ham and Malcolm. Thank you guys for coming.
Ham. Nice meeting you all.
Nice meeting you.
And I'm always following the GOAT, Dan, on Instagram. It's nice to actually talk with you.
Yeah, same here, brother, man.
Yeah.
This is
really nice to be on with you guys.
Yeah. Is there a place I can follow you? Any Ham or Nasser? Do you guys have anything where you guys post your games or anything?
Absolutely. You'll find me as Hamid on Najjar on Facebook, and it's a public profile, and at the same time as art.off.guide on Instagram. It's my art page. And, easily reachable through that as well.
I will get on that.
You'll find me on basically as Nasser Superbeast _Superbeast on Instagram. Okay. Or sometimes you'll find me on the Mr. Mean channel, because I play sometimes under like recorded games there.
Yeah. And that's been another nice byproduct of these. I know that a lot of the folks that we brought together have stayed in touch, and I think we all have a lot to learn from one another, because I know I learned a lot just sitting here listening. So
agreed.
Sage advice. Oh, and I did want to mention, because I have a wealth of Dragon magazines, the old Dragon magazines, and there is a section called Sage Advice.
Yeah.
And I was interested to see that many of the things that we talk about are also discussed just 40 years ago, which I think is so cool, you know. So check those out if you
Timeless.
have, you know, they're out there on the internet. I think there's PDFs everywhere. But yeah, but thank you all again. I'm gonna hit the old stop recording now, and we shall see you all soon.
Mm-hmm. If you like what we do here on the channel, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell, because it really helps us out.